So, as you can see, the talk is Whither WIPO will WIPO Whither. And what I want to do is focus on the role of WIPO around intellectual property and, frankly, make the argument that, in fact, it is withering. Not tomorrow, not next week, not next month or even next year, but I think it is unmistakable at this point in time that the influence that WIPO has over what our intellectual property frameworks look like internationally, but even more importantly domestically, whether in Canada or in many other countries, is diminishing and diminishing very quickly. I think that is largely because what we have seen over the last couple of decades is an increasing loss of consensus amongst the global community about the right approach, not just about how we characterize sites like ISOHunt, but frankly, what the exceptions look like, what the rights look like. And so in an organization that is largely able to move the ball forward on many of these issues on the basis of consensus, once you increasingly have trouble achieving that consensus, what you find is that those that want to move the ball forward pick up their ball and go play elsewhere. And that's, I think, exactly what we have started to see over the last number of years. I'm going to focus on three examples in particular, three reasons in particular why I think WIPO is withering. And I'll start with gridlock, which is something, frankly, that even officials from the Department of Foreign Affairs and others have cited when they started talking about ACTA, which I'll come to in a few minutes, and WIPO. If we think back to WIPO in the 1990s, at the time when it was developing the treaties that you heard about, the WCT and the WPPT, there was a lot of activity unquestionably taking place. There was also work on the WIPO Broadcasting Treaty. There was a lot of what is described as technical assistance, where WIPO would go into developing countries and assist them with respect to implementing some of their rules. So there was unquestionably a lot of activity taking place in that environment. I would argue that even at that time, the cracks in the foundation were beginning to appear. And so if one takes a look at, particularly, let's say, those WIPO Internet treaties, WCT, WPPT, the proposed language, let's say, around digital locks, around anti-circumvention, was nowhere near what the original proponents were hoping for. In fact, what emerged was there were proposals both from Europe and the United States. In fact, Europe was thinking largely not around the internet, but instead around satellite piracy and using that kind of thinking and that kind of language to try to move forward with the treaty. But their particular proposal raised almost universal objections from the country delegations that spoke up. And so what the treaty ultimately ended up with was the language that Everett rightly described as being quite flexible around the need to provide effective legal protection and adequate remedies, or adequate legal protection, effective legal remedies for these tools, the sort of thing that many countries have interpreted in many different ways. It was the only way at the time to effectively achieve consensus. So we started to see that in the 1990s. By the last decade, by the 2000s, I think the cracks were readily apparent, and I would argue that there were two main drivers behind those cracks, and that ultimately led to the kind of gridlock that we see at WIPO today. The first is, I think, quite notable in the context of a lot of things that we're talking about internationally, the new voice that people have, whether through the Arab Spring and social media. This wasn't social media so much, but previously, many UN organizations, certainly WIPO, was largely closed to NGO communities. It was very difficult for them to actively participate. But it was around 10 years ago or so that you started to see groups like the Electronic Frontier Foundation and other groups actively participate and attend the WIPO General Assembly meetings. And what I think the effect of that, of being able to take what was taking place in real time, broadcast it, obviously through the internet, through blogs, through other sorts of tools, to what was not quite a global audience, but people around the world who might want to track some of these issues, had the effect of opening up what was taking place in WIPO, and I think in a pretty important way. It started to create some real channels between developing world countries who had heard sort of one perspective on these issues, and suddenly now we're hearing some differing perspectives. And it meant that many people who were interested and concerned with intellectual property issues and were bringing many different perspectives to the table suddenly had an eye and an opening to what was taking place within WIPO, where previously it was largely closed. I think that actually led to what has been the major driver behind what we might see as gridlock, which was the WIPO development agenda in 2004, where you started to see many developing countries come together to say that the drive that WIPO had been on, or the road that WIPO had been on for many, many years, simply didn't reflect their interests or their concerns. And so their focus instead was to suggest that what WIPO really needed was to have a true development agenda, not one premised on so-called technical assistance, where developed countries would take their views of how you ought to run a patent office and say that this is how you ought to do it in a developing world, but rather truly address the particular concerns of those developing countries. And so what that has led to over the last number of years is work that, frankly, in the 1990s would have been largely unimaginable within WIPO. So work specifically on things like limitations and exceptions. We're very close now to a treaty on the visually impaired, the TVI treaty. The library community is pulling together a treaty as well under this. And so what we're seeing is big changes, also big changes with respect to what has become a big part of international intellectual property making, the enforcement agenda, where you get many different countries, even within WIPO, saying that their views of the importance of enforcement and how to go about enforcing IP rules differ. And so what that's meant for certainly some countries who might otherwise want to use WIPO as a core place to move forward on an IP enforcement agenda has meant that WIPO has by and large not been a particularly effective forum when it comes to enforcement-related issues. It's one reason that they've gone elsewhere. So where do we stand right now? Interestingly enough, the broadcasting treaty is actually back on track, and we're likely to see that happen, but we're also, I think, likely to see the TVI treaty, the Treaty for the Visually Impaired, happen as well. That is something, as I say, a number of years ago we never would have seen. I think that the longer-term work agenda is currently up in the air, in part because many of the major players within WIPO increasingly are questioning whether or not WIPO is the place that can achieve the sorts of outcomes that they're looking for. We've seen this actually happen before. This is, in a sense, almost a sequel or more. UNESCO, at one point in time, was seen as one of the primary fora for this. Groups that were looking for stronger protections ultimately found UNESCO was a tough place to do business because of the need for consensus. It moved to WIPO, which was good for a while, but increasingly, as I suggest, I think it is less effective for those that want to see a particular agenda move forward and move forward quickly. The other issue that is just in the last number of weeks on the horizon are potential funding issues. Because as I'm sure many in the room know, the issue with respect to Palestine being a member of UNESCO and the United States pulling funding from that group, apparently the plan amongst some is to apply for similar status in a range of other UN organizations, including WIPO. And were they to do that, U.S. law at a minimum would suggest that U.S. would have to pull funding from WIPO as well, which raises some very interesting issues, though WIPO is better funded than most other UN bodies. So part of the issue is gridlock. Part of the issue as well, I would suggest, is what has emerged as forum shopping. And so if you can't get consensus within WIPO, then you forum shop and look for other places. And what we now have with respect to dealing with intellectual property issues at an international level is truly an alphabet soup of organizations, all of whom are either actively trying to become part of this overall discussion and policy making and standard setting, or are being pushed or driven in that particular direction. So, of course, the WTO, the World Trade Organization, has been very active, and it had just now discussions as part of the TRIPS Council focusing on enforcement-related issues, the Anti-Counterfeiting of Trade Agreement, where it was defended by countries like Canada and others who signed on to ACTA, and then criticized by other countries who did not participate in the ACTA process. But there are many other groups, the World Health Organization, of course, dealing with pharmaceutical issues, which raises increasingly border-related issues. The WCU is the World's Customs Union, which has also focused on the same kind of things around border measures, powers of customs officials and the ability to seize products which sometimes may be infringing, sometimes simply are generics. The ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, has been on this issue. The IGF, the OECD, the G8, the G20, virtually all of these organizations are now being used to try to develop what might be seen as an international consensus that isn't happening at WIPO, and so there's this attempt to say, okay, we're starting to see many of the same sorts of principles develop in many of these other fora, and try to use that as the basis to influence the policies and laws that take place at national levels. Where those organizations don't work, though, the other possibility in terms of forum shopping is to create your own forum. And that's exactly what we saw over a number of years with the anti-counterfeiting trade agreement, which is described as a plurilateral agreement that brings together effectively a coalition of the willing, a relatively small number of countries, though economically important countries, who were quite open in saying that WIPO wasn't meeting their needs with respect to enforcement and instead wanted to try to identify a different process by which they could establish a new treaty. And thus was born ACTA, the Anti-Counterfeiting Trade Agreement. You can see it starts in 2004, and over a series of years, there's no sense in going through year by year, but you can see some of the countries involved, the US, Japan, the European Union, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, South Korea, Canada, Mexico, amongst the major countries involved, Switzerland as well. And over a series of years, we get a whole series of meetings. It should be noted that the initial expectation was that this would happen very quickly. In fact, documents either leaked or obtained through other sources make it clear that the proponents behind all of this thought back in 2006, 2007, that if you got the small number of countries together, surely their rules around issues pertaining to counterfeiting were going to be so similar that the ability to conclude a treaty very, very quickly would have been a possibility. In fact, in 2008, which was, of course, the election year, there were those in the United States that thought they would conclude the agreement in the same year that they started the discussions. There were some who thought this would be a going-away present for the Bush administration to try to get this done literally in a matter of months, because there was this thought that everybody was like-minded. Well, it turns out that there isn't even a consensus when you get these kinds of countries together, because it took meeting after meeting after meeting, and the pressure ultimately of congressional elections in the United States, where it was clear that the Obama administration was, towards the end, prepared to take a deal at almost any cost just so that there would be a deal in advance of these elections. So that in 2010, negotiators were meeting in new rounds almost every few weeks. As you can see, that you start seeing the meetings that take place in April, June, August, and September. Even the September one, which is where they concluded, it wasn't really concluded, so they had to meet again in December to actually go ahead and finalize some of the language. So the meeting was almost continuous, such that negotiators could barely come back and talk about any of this stuff and sort through it, because it was moving as quickly as it did. And the language that ultimately resulted was far more flexible than what the initial proponents had hoped for. The treaty itself was actually formally signed just a few weeks ago and is now open to ratification. But if we take a look back at what all of this does, I mean, the treaty itself, just so that you know what's there, the key part is this enforcement of IPR section, which deals with four main areas: civil enforcement, border measures, criminal enforcement, and internet-related issues. But the provisions themselves, while it will require some change within Canadian law and in some other countries, much, much more flexible than certainly its proponents envisioned when this began. So what we got instead was a fairly watered-down agreement. Watered down largely because of this inability to achieve consensus. You've got, even now, in a number of places, both in the United States and in the European Union, questions about whether or not these can be signed and ratified as is or require further approval. So there's questions about the legality of the agreements in both two of the major proponents, jurisdictions of major proponents on this, both the US and the EU. You've got countries who were excluded from this, saying that they don't see this as being a legitimate agreement that they're interested in joining. And as it suggests there, ultimately it's a counterfeiting agreement without the counterfeiters. Because it's an agreement that largely excluded the very countries that are seen as being the prime source of counterfeiting materials to begin with, and it's open to question just how effective it will be. What is also clear is that the forum shopping worked, at least in the small sense of achieving an agreement, quicker certainly than what might have been otherwise achieved at WIPO, and so the U.S. has moved on to other fora. And so now the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, of which Canada is currently not a member, is the new ACTA in a sense, where we see much of the same sorts of discussions taking place, and the clock has been scaled back to what the U.S. had initially proposed back in ACTA and is now hoping to achieve through the TPP, what it was unable to achieve through ACTA. So part of it's forum shopping. The third place, though, if you can't get consensus at an international organization, and if you can't get it even when you're trying to choose your own fora, the place to do all of this stuff is through bilateral pressure. And this certainly for a Canadian audience by now is well known. I'd argue it's the prime driver behind what we're seeing in C11, the current bill before the House of Commons, but we could debate that, I suppose, as well. Traditionally, the main source of pressure, let's say from the United States, which has been the prime proponent of all of this, has been what's known as the USTR Special 301 list. This is a process that the United States has undergone now for a number of years, where they identify countries that it argues currently contain substandard intellectual property rules. I've argued that Canada is on that list and has been on that list year after year after year. I've argued that it puts us in pretty good company. About 70% of the world's population is on that list. And they exclude many countries from sub-Saharan Africa to begin with. So if we were to take a look at the countries they were even thinking about, it's even higher than 70%. Almost everybody is on the list, and so it's a club perhaps that we want to be part of, I'm not sure. But more importantly, I think Canadian officials have been pretty steadfast in rejecting the entire process. They've done it privately, we know, but they've also done it publicly as well. These were comments that were made at one House of Commons committee, where you could see a Department of Foreign Affairs official noting that in regard to the list, Canada doesn't recognize the process. It lacks reliable and objective analysis, and it's driven entirely by U.S. industry. Canada's raised that regularly. We're not the only ones that have raised it regularly, but the U.S. continues to use the Special 301 process as an attempt to either embarrass or pressure many countries, including Canada, into engaging in reform. I wish I could say that based on Canada and other countries sort of calling out the U.S. and seeing the Special 301 report for what it is would have some sort of effect, but it's quite clear that that's not what's happening. Privately, there are lots of pressures ongoing within Canada, and so some of the WikiLeaks cables that were released earlier this year highlight some of that sort of activity. This is one from 2009 where an official in the then Industry Minister Tony Clement's office met with U.S. officials and actually encouraged the U.S. to elevate us on the Special 301 list, indicating that if we were elevated, seen as even a larger pirate nation, akin to a China or a Russia, that might actually have a positive effect of moving forward with legislation. That is a Canadian official encouraging the United States, I should repeat, to elevate us on the piracy watch list. Several years earlier, another WikiLeaks document indicated that then Industry Minister Maxime Bernier actually told the U.S. ambassador that he'd be willing to leak a copy of the Copyright Act, the proposed Copyright Act, before even tabling it on the floor of the House of Commons. So it's pretty clear that bilateral pressure has some effect, and it's sometimes disappointing to see the kind of effect it has on Canadian officials, but there it is. I think it's important to note that, as I say, this is only going to continue. In fact, legislation that was introduced just a couple of weeks ago in the United States called SOPA, the Stop Online Piracy Act, contains provisions that will statutorily mandate increased bilateral protection or increased bilateral pressure if enacted. And so one of the provisions you can see here actually calls on the Secretary of State and Secretary of Commerce to ensure that the protection in foreign countries of IP rights of the United States is a significant component of U.S. foreign and commercial policy in general and in relations with individual countries in particular. For anyone who has doubted that intellectual property has become clear parts of trade policy, indeed clear parts of foreign policy, this particular provision seeks to ensure that there is no lingering doubt about that, and in fact seeks to ensure that it becomes a, as you can see, core part of U.S. foreign policy. It actually goes even further, requiring, as you can see here, again, Secretary of State and Secretary of Commerce to ensure adequate resources at U.S. embassies or diplomatic missions. And what do we need these resources for in these U.S. embassies and missions? Cooperation and support for the host government's efforts, the host government, of course, being foreign governments like Canada, to conform its applicable laws, regulations, practices, and processes to enable it to honor its international and bilateral obligations with respect to the protection of IP rights. Statutorily mandating more resources for U.S. embassies and missions to ensure they can more effectively intervene and influence and lobby domestic activities in countries around the world. Now, countries, of course, are open to try to ensure that their national interests are well represented, but it is rather surprising, I think, to see it that stark, literally in black and white within legislation, as a core part of both foreign policy and a core part of what the U.S. is mandated to do. So what lies ahead? As I suggest, I think we're going to see diminishing WIPO influence. There's obviously lots of interesting and important work that happens there, but those that saw WIPO as an ideal fora to push forward on this intellectual property agenda have seen over the last decade that it is less positive in that sense. It's clear that the domestic and international lobbying and advocacy is only going to increase. And from a Canadian perspective, I think it also suggests that Bill C-11, the copyright bill before the House of Commons right now, which is likely to pass, if not by the end of the year, early next, is really only the beginning. It's clear that there is already another bill ready and waiting, one on IP enforcement that would allow Canada to be compliant with the Anti-Counterfeiting Trade Agreement. And the lesson to be learned from these sorts of pressures is that the pressure never really goes away. In fact, if what one does is adopt an approach that you cave to what I would see as, in many instances, true bullying pressure, it only encourages more of the same. Thanks very much for your attention.